Chapter 1: Industrial Boston and the Rise of Molasses. In the early 1900s, Boston was a thriving industrial city. The North End, in particular, was a bustling neighborhood filled with factories, warehouses, and the homes of immigrant workers. The streets were alive with activity as the clanging of machinery mingled with the sounds of vendors and the chatter of families. The neighborhood was a living testament to the industrial age. Dr. John Miller, economic historian.
The North End was a microcosm of Boston's industrial might. Factories and businesses lined the streets, and the neighborhood was a melting pot of cultures, primarily Italian immigrants seeking a better life in America. These immigrants brought with them their traditions, food, and a strong sense of community, which became the backbone of the neighborhood.
Molasses played a crucial role in the industrial landscape. It was imported from the Caribbean and stored in large tanks before being processed into industrial alcohol. This alcohol was essential for making explosives and other products, especially during World War I. The demand for molasses skyrocketed, and the industrial alcohol produced from it was a key component in munitions manufacturing. The Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of United States Industrial Alcohol, USIA, was one of the major players in the molasses trade. Their decision to construct a massive molasses tank in the North End would have far-reaching and tragic consequences. Chapter 2: The construction of the molasses tank. The molasses tank, constructed in 1915 by the Purity Distilling Company, was a marvel of industrial ambition, but a distillation in engineering. The project was undertaken to store the increasing quantities of molasses needed for wartime production. Dr. Robert Thompson, engineer.
The tank was hastily built to meet the rising demand for industrial alcohol during World War I. It stood 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter, and had a capacity of 2.3 million gallons of molasses. However, the construction was rushed and many safety protocols were ignored. The tank was built with thin steel plates and poor quality rivets, which were not adequate for containing such a large volume of liquid.
The tank's design flaws were apparent from the start. It was made of thin steel plates that were inadequate for holding such a massive volume of liquid. The rivets used were substandard, and the entire structure was prone to leaks. Despite these obvious issues, the tank was filled to capacity. Residents of the North End grew accustomed to its presence, often seeing molasses leaking from its seams. The sweet smell of molasses was a constant in the air, and children would collect the leaking syrup in jars. Maria Rossi, local historian.
My grandmother used to tell stories about how the children would collect molasses in jars from the leaking tank. It was a part of daily life in the North End, and no one could have imagined the danger it posed.
Despite numerous complaints and reports of leaks, the Purity Distilling Company took minimal action. The tank was simply painted brown to hide the leaks, a superficial fix that did nothing to address the underlying structural issues. Chapter 3: The Lead-Up to Disaster. As the winter of 1918 to 1919 progressed, Boston experienced fluctuating temperatures. The city saw unseasonably warm days followed by freezing cold nights. On January 15, 1919, an unusually warm day began with temperatures reaching around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a significant temperature swing. The rapid temperature change, combined with the fermentation of the molasses inside the tank, created a buildup of gas and pressure. This fermentation process was a natural result of the sugars in the molasses breaking down, producing carbon dioxide. Dr. Jane Smith, historian.
The fermentation process likely produced carbon dioxide, increasing the internal pressure within the tank. Coupled with the structural weaknesses, this was a recipe for disaster. The tank was essentially a ticking time bomb, and the warm weather was the final trigger.
At approximately 12:30 p.m., the pressure became too much for the tank to bear. Without warning, it burst open, unleashing a catastrophic flood of molasses. Chapter 4: The Disaster Unfolds. A wave of molasses, estimated to be 25 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour, surged through the streets of the North End. The sheer force and speed of the wave were devastating, sweeping away everything in its path. Antonio D'Estasio, resident.
I was just a boy playing in the street with my friends. Suddenly, we heard a loud bang and the ground shook. We turned and saw this massive dark wave coming towards us. We ran as fast as we could, but the molasses caught up with us. It was like being swallowed by a monster.
Buildings were torn from their foundations, freight cars were hurled from their tracks, and people and animals were caught in the sticky, suffocating wave. The molasses poured into homes, businesses, and basements, trapping residents inside. The force of the flood was so great that it destroyed several city blocks, leaving a path of destruction in its wake. Rescue efforts were immediate but extremely challenging.